It is Wednesday, 1 o'clock. Welcome to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, live and interactive, along with Edgar Zazwata, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. We are honored to have you with us on the show today. Go ahead and jump onto our chat, say hello, let us know where you're watching from today and what's happening over in your region. Ellen Wheeler, our very, very first person on the chat today. Ellen, I swear, Ellen, you are like the big winner for who gets on the chat for the very first time every show. Edgar, how are you, man?
Hey, I'm doing good, Najwa, but only one show this week? You're slacking. You didn't even propose some extra shows, come a couple times a week.
Not only do we only have one show this week, but I gave you Monday off too.
I appreciate that.
Hey, we got a good show for you guys today. We've got a couple of members of ACSA's governmental relations team on the show to talk about the end of the legislative session and the budget cleanup bill. We also have, we're also going to talk about CDPH guidance and those sports and activities guidelines that so many of you have been waiting for. Edgar, I didn't even know that they had come out until all of a sudden on Thursday, you and I are in a meeting and Serette, who's going to come on here, starts talking about them. And I'm like, wait a minute, where did these things come from? It was like a Wednesday night news drop, wasn't it?
Yeah, as much fanfare as we gave this guidance over the last couple months, you would think CDPH would have shot it out of a cannon or something with fireworks. But no. But I think actually to that point, I think one of the things that it didn't spell out, and I think this is some of the conversation we'll have with Serette, is that, yeah, maybe the field might have been expecting a little bit more. CDPH is taking a particular approach here. But I am excited today to kind of jump into this. And if you don't mind, Naj, for a second, I got to brag about my team because I know we go through this. Yes. We go through this exercise every week about, who do our folks want to hear from? And we always have a big list of, whether it be elected officials or folks from the capital community. But I have to say, so many times where we come back to is like the knowledge we kind of have here is in-house. And so hopefully I'm not putting too much pressure on Iván and Serette as they're coming on that they're going to have all the answers. But that's why I felt good after all the weeks of hearing about whether it be independent study from different perspectives, hearing about the health guidance from different perspectives, having our internal team kind of come in and try to translate a little bit of that seemed appropriate this week. Yeah,
and I totally agree with you. In fact, there's really a buzz over there on your half of the building today because so many of your members, your team members are here and really bringing that wealth of knowledge. It's fantastic. Want to say hello to Lisa, Spencer, Dominique, Liz, Daniel Thigpen over at San Juan Unified School District is with us. I do want to point out, and now I have to go look for it, Deanna Kulian from Palm Springs, USC. Deanna has dropped in something about college football each of the last couple of weeks. And I want to point out to Deanna that I have the helmets from Penn State and San Diego State, both winners this week. So I wanted to make sure that I reflected that. Also want to see if I can bring some attention to this. Susan Denton is one of our viewers here. And a few weeks back when we initially talked about, hey, college football is back. We're very excited about it. Susan Denton put in something about the University of Arizona. Now, you being a Pac-12 guy, Edgar, you know the University of Arizona. But this week, Arizona plays San Diego State. And so I'm wondering if Susan wants to get in on a little friendly wager here before the end of the show, because that's the kind of thing that we would do here.
Yeah, and some people may balk at it that it was San Jose State. San Jose State has a good team. They had a good team last year. Trojans got their first victory. So I'm if Wes was here, and I think Wes was actually at the game, I know he would give us some firsthand analysis. Let me give a shout out myself, Naj. I saw on the chat. Let me see if I can find Spencer Gooch from Orange County. First legislative lunch break. First one.
Oh, hey.
So, you know what my reaction is well, they got to go back and watch how many episodes have we had here? I'm sure
we've done a lot.
Yeah. I think that's what you do, right? Like you binge watch like you do on Netflix. They're all available on YouTube, right? And Facebook.
Yeah.
So that's my recommendation.
You know, what's funny is you and I could just go down to Wes's office and pull a camera in there and see what his reaction was from the game if he was at the USC San Jose State game. Maybe we need to go throw our camera team down in there. and make that happen. Hey, before we get to our couple of guests, Edgar, you and I have done a lot of breakfast meetings with our members, charter meetings, region meetings. Just give me estimate. How many people have you had a breakfast meeting with, as far as our members are concerned, at a breakfast meeting in your years? Just give me a
Wow, you're coming in with some very specific details. How many over the course?
How many? Just give me like I went to a region meeting here and I had this number, this many people there.
Oh, this many people at the actual breakfast.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I know. And this is the beautiful part about ACSA. I've been to some where it's literally you come in and it's 8 of the most dedicated members you will ever see in your life. And I'm always amazed by how people have to travel, especially in some of our more rural regions. And on the flip side, I've shown up and they have, how are these many people here at 7 a.m. before they have to go to work? So I think it runs the gamut there.
So I met with the members today, Region 7, the Stanislaus Charter. And if we're going to hang our hat on something with all of these virtual meetings and the benefit of these virtual meetings, it's clearly the engagement of members in a larger scale, because there isn't the driving. We had almost 100 members on the meeting today, almost 100. I'm telling you, Edgar, they weren't there to see me. That was a very, very engaged group. So, it's a benefit. It certainly is.
And good for you. Hey, you woke up, you got there, you got back. So it's been a productive day for you as well.
Well, I will say this. You and I both know that the internet capabilities in my home are not good. So I drove into the office today to do this, but I have not seen so many smiling faces this morning at 7 a.m. in quite some time. So good to see all of our members over in Region 7. All right, let's go ahead. Let's bring in our guest today, Iván Carrillo, ACSA Legislative Advocate, Serette Kaminski, ACSA Legislative Advocate, both with us here on the show today to talk about the end of session, these evolving CDPH guidelines and information that the state likes to throw at us at the very last minute and then not tell us about it. Iván, Serette, so good to have you guys on the show with us. Iván, who's talking to you?
I gave you a heads up ahead of time. My computer screen with the images is here and my camera's here. So.
Okay. All right. I thought somebody was talking to you outside your window. Hey, let me ask you. First. Key takeaways from that budget cleanup bill. Key takeaways. Biggest omissions at the end of legislative session. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so as was expected, AB 167 was the vehicle with budget cleanup related to AB 130, related to independent study. I think there were no huge surprises here. We didn't anticipate any big sweeping changes. It had become clear to us that the legislature and the administration was very much committed to the IS design that they put in place with AB 130, and they held true to that. With that said, there are certainly some changes that some of which are helpful, and some this is related to the master agreement, related to substitute teachers. So I can get into some of those details here momentarily. But in terms of biggest omissions, a couple that I'll point out that I know that our folks were talking about was the 5-day timeline in which a student must be returned to in-person instruction after a request is made. Nothing was done on that front to change that requirement. So that certainly was one of the big ones. So yeah, no real big sweeping changes. This conversation is not over. I think that's another point I'll make is that certainly this piece of legislation is going to get signed. It'll get voted on later this week and sent to the governor's office. But there's going to be a lot of conversation still on independent study. We're going to have to deal with any potential regulations that the state board puts into place related to IS. There may very well be legislation come January that makes further changes. The audit guide will be put into place and be developed by spring. So this conversation is long from over. Our members, we're going to ask you to continue to stay engaged and continue to inform us and policymakers of continued changes that are needed. But again, no real big sweeping changes, but there were certainly some changes around the edges that that hopefully by and large will be helpful to you in the field as you implement the IS requirements.
Serette, so switching tracks a little bit to our more of the public health side, as you know, and you helped us set this up. We got Dr. Sohail Sood last week, the new head of the Safe Schools for All team here with CDPH. And so we talked a lot of components, and then later that afternoon, lo and behold, there was some new guidance. We're not taking credit for any of this, right? I'm not trying to imply that it was because of us, but we have been asking a lot of questions. So give an update on what changed. What did we learn with the latest guidance from CDPH?
Sure thing. Good afternoon, and thanks for that warm welcome. Well, as you said, last week, they provided more clarification in their guidance, but they also added more information to their FAQs, so that's worth a look. In regards to the guidance, they clarified that the modified quarantine piece, what they did was they confirmed the setting of exposure. It can be either outdoors or indoors, and before modified quarantine definition, that only applied to exposure inside. They also put in a small revision to section 9 of the guidance, and for our members who are really steeped in this document, this is the section that is about the quarantine duration recommendations for unvaccinated close contacts. So the update now confirms that this section applies to students in either modified or standard quarantine. And the last part of the guidance that was updated was something that, as Edgar said, should have been shot out of a cannon, right? We've been expecting this for months. That small section 16 has now been added regarding school-based extracurricular activities. Let me give you a couple of quick highlights from that. Masks are required for all persons while playing indoor sports, unless wearing a mask during play has been determined to pose a choking hazard by a well-recognized health authority, such as the American Academy of Pediatrics. So what they say is that there should be exemptions to wearing a mask for swimming, diving, water polo, competitive cheerleading, and gymnastics and wrestling. And the updated guidance also has a couple of caveats for band in sports. So in the instance where you're playing an instrument and that instrument can't be played without a face covering, so for example, wind instruments, or when wearing a mask during play poses a choking hazard, then you should follow one of the following 3 options: that these activities can be conducted outdoors, that you use a modified face covering. So that could also be a bell covering when playing wind and brass instruments, and also maintain 6 feet of physical distancing. Or the other thing you can do is perform at least weekly screening testing with either PCR testing or antigen testing of all individuals, including those who are fully vaccinated. So that's the update on CDPH guidance.
You know, Edgar, what's funny about this is Serette is our newest member here in the governmental relations team. So we could give her a hard time. She really nailed all of those points right there. But since Wednesday night when this came out, she's been so excited that she's been working on her material, getting ready for this broadcast. So Serette, thank you for that. Iván, let me ask you what's next related to independent study.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me dig into a little bit more details here, if you don't mind. A couple of things that I referenced in the opening. So in terms of master agreements, we had heard a lot about this, that there was real ambiguity in terms of the timeline in which these master agreements had to be collected. So what we see in the budget cleanup legislation is that does specify that the 30-day window for collecting a signed master agreement begins on the first day of instruction for independent study. So there was, again, some ambiguity as to whether or not it was 30 days from the first day of the school year or from the date of instruction. So it is from the first date of instruction. It should also be noted that for those schools that have already started, have long or are weeks, if not months into their school year, that you have up until October 15th to collect these signed master agreements. So again, it's either 30 days or October 15th, whichever is later. There also is some clarity related to the student, parent, teacher conferences that are to take place, clarifying that these in fact only have to take place upon a parent or guardian's request. So again, this was another area that it was unclear whether or not this had to take place for all students before they go in to IS and before a master agreement is signed. But that's not the case. It's only upon request that those meetings have to take place prior to collecting a master agreement. One other thing that I'll point out is and we had anticipated this, we had gotten signals ahead of time, was that there is language in there clarifying that LEAs can collect apportionment for students who are quarantining. So that's made clear in the legislation. There are changes to the J13A process, so I can dig into those if that's helpful. But again, in terms of next steps, Naj, and your question, this bill will be voted on by both houses of the legislature by Friday. It'll then go to the governor's desk, where he will certainly be signing it because it is a three-party agreement. At that point, we aren't certain, although we expect that there will be some regulatory changes. So that we'll have some greater clarity in the fall from the state board when those conversations will start up and what they may look like. And then in terms of the audit guide, that has to be done by next spring, and certainly that piece is going to be critical for the field in terms of adhering to these requirements. So that process will begin here in the fall as well. In terms of legislation, and then I'll wrap up with this, is we fully recognize that there are some real legitimate challenges that you all are facing. You all have been making us and policymakers aware of this. And so the opportunity for potential follow-up legislation, there may very well be, especially if new challenges present themselves, if challenges worsen, the need for legislation may present itself, and we may get some legislative interest, and that would take place in January.
Thanks for all that information, Iván. Going back to Serette for a second, kind of in the same vein, Iván, talking about, independent study and maybe some of the challenges that the field had expressed that led to some of this cleanup. Now on the guidance, public health side, what are we hearing from our members? What are the issues that are coming up most? What's being elevated out there?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest hurdles that school leaders talk about in regards to the CDPH guidance is the contact tracing and the testing for staff and students. I know Superintendent Ron Caruth spoke eloquently to this issue last week. He talked about how there's a ripple effect when you have staff conducting the contact tracing on cases. There's going to be a 30-minute conversation for each of the, say, 30 people who might have been exposed. And then if there's exposure in any of those cases, then you have to do it again for all those new contacts. And this workload expands exponentially quite quickly. The other issue that is, of course, at the surface now that there are exposures is the twice weekly screening for modified quarantine. And add to that we now are facing national supply issues with Binax Now kits and other delays as schools ramp up their testing infrastructure. Any of these challenges could result in less in-person instruction. I do want to mention that the state's testing task force, they do offer twice weekly office hours to help school leaders navigate the testing piece. And all of their resources can be found on the Safe Schools for All website. That's schools.covid19.ca.gov.
I want to thank all of you putting in your questions and your comments. Go ahead and keep doing that. I want to just go ahead and go a little rapid fire here, if you guys don't mind, because we do have questions out there. So let me start with Alan Miller, and I'll have either of you go ahead and jump in on this. Alan Miller asked, do electives, i.e. band, choir, performing arts, and PE that are part of these student schedules fall under the extracurricular category as it pertains to modified quarantine protocols? Serette, this is in your wheelhouse, but I'll give it to either one of you.
The way I've heard that answered is that it falls under instructional minutes, and so that's the modified quarantine. And I would reference the FAQs. There is some additional language that's been added that speaks to PE, and electives, again, would be the instructional minutes, not extracurricular. And also in the guidance, in the FAQs, when you get down to the very end of the FAQs, it does have a piece about number 12 about extracurricular activities and, do they apply to non-school activities? And then they have 5 different links there that you can click on to find a little bit more about what you're looking for exactly.
Now, I'll go to Iván next with the independent study question. I believe it's from Mark Campbell. He notes tiered re-engagement for students not participating in live synchronous instruction, but they're completing all their schoolwork. Are we essentially requiring synchronous work now? I don't know if that makes sense. Iván, if you want to touch on that.
So I want to point out in terms of the tiered re-engagement that there are new triggers that the field should be aware of for tiered re-engagement. So let me read these. But one of them is that if a student is non-participatory, and I'll define that here in a moment, for greater than 3 school days or 60% of scheduled days of synchronous instruction within a given month, then that would trigger tiered re-engagement. And then secondly, if a student misses 10% of required instructional time over the course of 4 weeks in a row. So certainly the field needs to be aware that we have to be increased monitoring and tracking of participation. So in terms of how a non-participation is defined, because this did change in this budget cleanup legislation, it's for a student who does not participate in live synchronous instruction or live interaction for a scheduled school day. So that triggers the non-participatory, that meets the non-participatory definition. And then if it meets those thresholds that I just specified, then it would trigger the tiered re-engagement. I'll put these definitions in the chat box just so you can read them to better digest them as well.
And I know that Mike Rich asked about a link to the FAQs that are being referenced. We'll have our team behind the scenes go ahead and put that in. Brad asked the question, is time value certification, work assigned, work completed, still a requirement for students put on short-term independent study for quarantines in order to collect apportionment for their absences? What can you guys tell us?
Yes, that is the case. So for short-term IS, regardless of the amount of time, students are required to meet all the requirements, except for a few, including transitioning them back to within 5-day time frame, including the tiered re-engagement. But time value of work would still apply for purposes of apportionment.
Serette, I believe we got a couple questions about who's captured in extracurricular activities and whether after school also pertains there, and how does that impact the modified quarantine?
Wow, we always get the best questions. I'm actually looking at the guidance just to get clarity on that one. I would say my gut reaction is to say if it's happening in an LEA that does qualify, but I do need to look into that one a little bit more. Just give me a moment. Thanks.
Yeah, and this is, by no means like the factual answer. I will add that based on what we heard from the CDPH officials, what they're trying to get at the spirit of it. And we've seen this example happen numerous times with the guidance, as we're a broken record here. This is being written from public health folks, right? Mm-hmm. Not from school officials. So sometimes frankly, a lot of times because of your questions, we then go and ask, hey, did we think about this? They hadn't even thought about it, right? And my guess is that their intent there is going to be if youth that are meeting these requirements, to Serette's point, and they're meeting the requirements of mask to mask, that the whole point there is that they haven't had the same level of exposure and should be able to stay in school.
Let me get to Darla Beeson's question. She asks, are there any more clarity offered for special ed students who require extensive supports and parents are requesting independent study? Any updates on special ed students and IS?
No, unfortunately, Darla, this is one of the areas where we didn't see any movement. And I know that this is a real legitimate issue that we've been hearing from folks throughout the state. But unfortunately, there were no changes as it relates to how to handle students with in these cases that require, as part of their IEPs, just these really extensive supports and services that are really difficult to provide in the home and through a virtual format. So unfortunately not. We're continuing to talk about the issue and amplifying and elevating this, but it's not included in the budget legislation.
Hey, Iván, Amy points out an issue that I know we brought in front of the policymakers a number of times, that these 15 days of short-term IS may not be sufficient if somebody would have to be quarantined numerous times. So the question being, do they have to then meet all of the daily synchronous requirements if they're quarantined many times? So maybe one, you could answer the question to the best of our ability, and then two, maybe give a little bit of context of what was either the response or the pushback that we got when we brought this issue up.
Yeah, so you're exactly right, Amy, that after the 15 days that these students would have to meet the synchronous and live interaction requirements that's aligned to their grade level. And just as Edgar just pointed out, we had been talking about this a lot, but unfortunately we got a lot of pushback, and it was really about the legislatures and the administration's concern about educational quality, and that they felt very strongly that if students were out, regardless of reason, for more than 15 cumulative days, that there should be a higher level of service and instruction that's provided to them. We try to make the distinction that between those who are out greater than 15 days because it's a choice of theirs and their parents to be served through long-term independent study, versus those who are forced to be out for quarantining purposes. But unfortunately, the decision makers, this logic didn't resonate with them, and they held steadfast to those requirements being applied to all students, regardless of the reason that they go above the 15 days.
Jeff Oakes asked the question, pardon me. He publishes one of the codes from Education Code says that the governing board has a resolution that the courses are equivalent to on-campus courses. Does this have to be a physical resolution the board acts on each year?
So it has to be a formal board resolution that's adopted for this school year. So that's part of requirements that adhere to IS for the purposes of this coming school year. So yes, it has to be a formal adoption by the board that lays out all the different programmatic requirements aligned to AB 130, and the course offerings is one of those.
Serette, I know you hate being stumped, right? So I know you were using your speed reading there, and I think you found a little bit more to Karen's original question about it.
Yeah, I do. It bothers me when I get stumped like that, but this was a really good question, and it deserves more clarity. So I'm glad that it's been asked. So the question was, is after school care considered extracurricular? So I could tell you from the FAQs, number 8, it does qualify for modified quarantine. However, it's unclear when you're reading the guidance if that means that if someone is in modified quarantine due to exposure, if they have to abstain from after school care. So I'm going to try to get clarity on this, and we'll have to get that back out to our members. Maybe we can shoot it out in a tweet when I get some clarity from CDPH on this. Thanks for letting me come back to it.
Let me just really quickly. I want to find the question here. So give me just a moment, because here you go, from Michelle Murphy. Michelle asks, there is one line that now says when you exclude students from campus for not wearing a mask? Is that allowable? Michelle, we don't want to give you an answer that isn't informed, because I suspect that there's something legal that goes with that. And so we're not ignoring the question, but we want to follow up, and we'll hopefully be able to get an answer for you later today, or may have to wait a little bit on that one, because we want to make sure we talk with attorneys before we give you an answer on that one. Let me ask this question from Angela Shell. She asked, what documentation needs to be fulfilled in order for LEAs to collect apportionment for STIS? In the past, it was all completed student work during STIS.
Yeah, so we'll have to circle back on that, but to provide the details. But again, it's still our understanding in our initial read that it's still based on completed work.
I'll ask both of you kind of a big picture question here as we enter the last week of the legislative session. We know that we haven't talked a lot about, we'll probably next Wednesday we'll be talking about this in some form. There's an election next week. So there's a lot going on, right? So I'll start first with Iván on the independent study side, and then I'll ask Serette similarly on the guidance side. What do you see next? I know we always are afraid and play too much of crystal ball, but given the discussions, I can't help but to acknowledge some of the frustration I see even in the chat, right? That, yeah, some of these changes, sure, it may adjust some things. Some of the fundamental issues, whether staffing or folks just being able to deal with the magnitude of this, that doesn't seem like it's going away. So it's not like this session's going to be over and yeah, it's fixed. So I'm just curious your guys' thoughts on where do we go from here. I'll start with Iván.
Yeah, well, certainly once the recall is behind us, the election, then that deals with that political layer and what that has meant in terms of these policy discussions, because it certainly has impacted the policy discussions. So part of this is going to be dependent on what trends we continue to see with the COVID-19 and with the Delta variant or any other variants. And so certainly if things continue to worsen, if we continue to see upticks in the number of families that want to be served through independent study, then that's going to continue to present challenges that our members have been talking about very clearly over the last month or so since schools reopened, and give even more and more legitimacy to those issues. And so these are going to be issues that months in, I think are going to be harder for the policymakers to be able to ignore. So certainly, again, it depends on how trends go. But one of the trends we know isn't going to be resolved on the immediate end is the staffing issue. And so the staffing shortage, there were some changes that certainly are helpful. And I think we have to give credit to the legislature for being responsive and the administration on that end. So one of those, and I didn't mention it yet, was extending the duration of time that a substitute can teach in any one assignment. That's been extended up to 60 days. But again, that's not a silver bullet. That doesn't address all the staffing inabilities that LEAs have been experiencing. So these are the type of issues that we'll have to continue that they'll have to be forced to reckon with. So we'll see what that means in terms of legislation. But again, we know that the audit guide is going to be very critical in terms of how the field is interpreting these statutes, how they're supposed to be adhering to these different changes. So we'll be engaged in that process and giving the field insights in terms of how that develops as well.
Thanks, Iván. And Serette, what would you say on the CDPH guidance side? What's kind of the forecast on what we may see?
Variants will continue to play a role. We're seeing how the more contagious and transmissible Delta variant has affected fully vaccinated people. That's why fully vaccinated people are now recommended to wear masks indoors in California. And we've been hearing about the Lambda variant out of Peru, and now there's the Mu variant out of Colombia. I don't think this will be the end of variants, and the guidance will have to evolve as the situation changes. And the other huge unknown out of this is the results of the recall election. John Fensterwald from EdSource did a really nice piece about this today. All 4 of the top Republican candidates running say that they will rescind the requirement for students and teachers to wear masks to ward off COVID infections. And they all oppose state-imposed mandates for COVID vaccinations for public employees. And we might see some of Newsom's other emergency executive orders rescinded. So lastly, if there is someone other than Governor Newsom, you might start to see key figures at CDPH and other public agencies replaced. And of course, with any new leadership, there can also be a domino effect when even careerists who may not require appointment and confirmation, they might also start to seek new employment. So I guess we'll see.
Hey, Naj, do you mind if I mention one other?
Please, go ahead.
That we saw in AB 167?
Yep.
So this is related to AB 104. This is a piece of legislation that I know a number that you all have become very familiar with. It primarily dealt with student retention, but another piece that AB 104 had included was related to grade changes and the ability for families to be able to request a pass, no pass grade in place of a letter grade. And so the deadline for those requests has been extended or will be extended as part of this budget cleanup legislation. So requests will be able to be made by families through October 1st. The legislation does permit LEAs to go beyond October 1st if they feel inclined. But at a minimum, LEAs will have to accept any request that's come in after the deadline up until this point, as well as any requests for these grade changes through October 1st.
And I noticed that there are a number of questions that have come in. Jim, Steve, Jeff, Carol, and Gary. Iván and Serette are still going to stay on with us on the chat. But before we say goodbye to them, from this is Iván's last week here with us at ACSA. And it's my understanding, Iván, that you're leaving for Capital Advisors and that for some reason, Kevin Gordon, who's been a guest here on this show before, somehow sweetened the pot by saying that the coffee was better over at Capital Advisors than it is here in this office. Is that true?
He specifically said he would buy me coffee from my favorite specialty coffee place here nearby.
For those that don't know, and we have to give Iván a hard time, first I have to say, so obviously bittersweet, as Iván has been not only a staple here on this show, but a heart of our team, responsible so much of the advocacy, so much, especially throughout the pandemic. So it's always bittersweet when a member of your team goes off and finds the opportunities. And so we're happy for him. Now, here's the good news. Even though he may not be wearing the ACSA hat, he's still going to be wearing the ACSA hat because it's been apparent, because we've had Kevin and Barrett and folks, the Capital Advisors team is part of the broader ACSA team as well. So we work with them. We're a client of theirs. So we will still have Iván at our disposal. But obviously just a huge debt of gratitude for all the work that Iván has done on behalf of our members over his tenure here. And back to the coffee. Iván's kind of coffee snob, so we have to give him a hard time about that. He doesn't like the office coffee, instant coffee. So so that's the running joke that he got offered some better coffee somewhere else.
Something tells me we can run with that joke a lot. Something tells me I think we can stay with that one. Serette Kaminski and Iván Carrillo, ACSA legislative advocates. Serette and Iván, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Edgar, I want to ask you this question because it is the end of the legislative session. Can you maybe just kind of compare and contrast for our viewers what the legislative session is like now during the pandemic in comparison to how it was pre-pandemic and maybe what the last kind of week looks like?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, especially over, like, we could do a short comparison, even just how it was last year at the end of the session, trying to navigate still in the midst of the shutdowns. The legislature had to go in and out. last year was meeting virtually. Some of it was meeting in person. So it obviously very different than traditionally, where the Capitol building would literally be swarmed with people, with lobbyists, representative from interest groups, folks really pushing for last minute changes. So there's still a lot of hustle and bustle in the Capitol, very different with some of the restrictions. You know, a lot of the advocacy happens virtually, via phone, other means. Obviously, the one thing we've been saying is our folks' voices still do matter. I saw one question about, I know it gets confusing sometimes, we get into Sacramento talk up here. Some of these things that Iván was talking about, they're in consideration still technically. They're going to be voted on here at the end of the week. I think I saw the question about the substitute change, which is a big one actually for all, you know, we've been talking about that pre-pandemic, about trying to get that flexibility from 30 days to 60 days for a long time. And I think Steve also asked about special ed. It also applies there. So that's a significant change. Although that's still under consideration, it's going to be voted on this week. We can say with confidence, since all three parties, the Assembly, the Senate, leadership, and the governor's office have already agreed, it's almost undoubtedly going to go into get enacted and go into law.
Hey, let me ask this question, because we were giving Iván a hard time about the coffee over at Capitol Advisors, and then Marianne Doyle, who one of our great members, she says, in addition to saying you're going to be greatly missed, Iván, and yes, the coffee is better. Have you had the coffee over at Capitol Advisors? I know you've had to do this show over there before. Is it really better?
Are you asking me? Oh,
I'm asking you.
You see, this is where I have to give my brother Iván a hard time. My palate towards coffee, I don't have a problem with the Keurig or the. I will make no judgment on the ACSA coffee that's down the hall. You know, when in need of caffeine, I don't discriminate.
There you go. There you go. If there are other vices that you want to discuss with Edgar and I'm sure we can fill in, but coffee isn't one of them. All right, Edgar, good seeing you. Good show today. We'll see you next week.
Well, I'm sure we will have things to talk about here after another busy week. So see you next week.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, folks, so much for being with us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We're back on Wednesdays, 1 p.m. live and interactive on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the day.